Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. My name is Ruzbe Parsi. I'm head of the Middle East and North Africa program at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. And I will act as a moderator for this conversation, which is going to be about the situation in Afghanistan and prospects for development in that country. And in order to do this, we have two guests with long experience in general of dealing with difficult situations like the ones that seem to reoccur in Afghanistan, but also Afghanistan in particular. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetic order. First, we have Fatima Ayub, who is an Afghan political analyst with more than 15 years of experience studying this particular conflict, but also conflicts and security and human rights issues in general. She has worked for major human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Our second guest is Andreas Stefansson. He's a development practitioner with several years of experience from Afghanistan. And since 2017, he's also the Secretary General of the Swedish Committee for Afghanistan, Svenska Afghanistan-kommittén, who is one of the organizations that have the longest experience of being able to continuously work in Afghanistan. Together with their help, we're going to try and understand and explore what's going on in Afghanistan, but also try and perhaps tease out some of the more structural issues and not get stuck in the latest political developments necessarily. In order to do this, we've asked Andreas to kind of set the scene for us, what's going on from a kind of a contemporary history perspective and how we have gotten to the point that we are now. Andreas, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ruzbe. Nice to meet you, Fatima, as well, and everybody who's listening. So let me just say, to start with, I want to thank Swedish Institute of International Affairs for arranging this webinar and for the invitation. I really look forward to this conversation. I'll try to take us through a quick recap of conflicts and developments. I'll start first with stating a bit of what we see Afghanistan being at today, and then doing a recap of the last 4 decades, and then ending up with a minute on recent political developments. So I was in Kabul in March last time, and I asked an old Afghan friend, how are things now? And what he answered was, oh, it's pretty miserable. And then when I went on with the question, so where do you think things are heading the coming months? And he replied, it's just going to get worse. And that's a pretty sad assessment, but unfortunately, growing numbers of people hold that view. And I suppose that's kind of what we tend to think about Afghanistan. Also see the title of the seminar, Perpetual Tragedy, Perpetual Crisis. And surely there's a lot of tragedy with Afghanistan. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. Also now with the pandemic impacting socioeconomically, you have about 70% actually in Afghanistan today that are considered to live below poverty line. Corruption, it's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. According to Transparency International, it's the 15th most corrupt country in the world. There have been some small improvements there, but still very bad. It's one of the most insecure countries in the world, alongside Syria, Yemen, South Sudan. Last years, we've had about 10 to 12,000 war-related civilian casualties annually. It's also one of the most dangerous countries in the world for aid workers. And lately, we've also seen increased targeting of killings of human rights activists, society activists, and so on. And then you have a small but still presence of IS as well. And it's also considered one of the worst countries in the world to be a woman and child. So quite a gloomy picture, but we should not forget, and I think this is important, there are also some quite astonishing positive developments that have taken place. And I think that it's important to be fair in an assessment of the country and also when looking at the prospects for the future. 3 examples: access to education. 2 decades ago, you only had about 500,000 kids in school, mostly boys. Today, you have about 7 or 8 million kids, of which 40% are girls in schools. So you have a first generation in history of Afghanistan that can start to read and write. And we should not underestimate the long-term transformational effects that has on society. Access to healthcare. Today, about 2/3 of the population actually have walking distance to a health facility. The repeated nationwide vaccination campaigns. There's a growing cadre of qualified midwives, including in villages. It's starting to bring down maternal and child mortality from very high levels. And thirdly, you have an increased presence of participation and participation of women in society in Afghanistan, in the private sector, in media, decision making. Actually, in the Afghan parliament today, there is a higher proportion of women than you have in the US Congress. So how did Afghanistan get here to this mixed picture? And here comes the attempt at a quick recap of 4 decades. Let's start with the communist coup in 1978. A communist regime that took power, got Soviet backing, but quickly started to face resistance among the population by what was called the Mujahideen. Reacted to the regime's radical reform agenda, its perceived atheism and urban bias. So it was a quite rural-based conservative uprising with Islam as a unifying force among different ethnic groups and tribes. And the reaction also reflects somehow a rural-urban divide you have in Afghanistan, rural reactions against swift modernization attempts. And that you've seen that in history as well in Afghanistan. With rural Afghanistan being quite autonomous, much left to its own, and often perceiving central government very much as an intruder into local affairs. And I would say you see elements of this also today in reactions or reluctance in some rural areas to central government reform agendas, attempts to modernize or impose rule of law. And to some extent, Taliban also then representing or capitalizing on that. 1979, then, Soviet invades to back up the Afghan communist regime. And by the way, this is also the impetus to the Swedish committee creation. We were first called the Soviet Out of Afghanistan campaign, standing up for Afghanistan's independence. And 2 years later, we started with humanitarian work that has then developed into large-scale development programming within education, health, and rural development. And today we are one of the biggest actors in the country with about 6,000 local staff. The Soviet occupation lasted for 10 years. It was a bloody 10-year war with over 1 million Afghans killed and more than 6 million refugees fleeing into Iran and Pakistan. And then during that period also crumbling, collapsing state. And the Mujahideen then being supported by the US, part of a Cold War logic, and also Saudi and Pakistan. And Saudi, of course, perceiving it as a battle to defend Islam. What you saw then also was then the communist regime increasingly only controlling big cities, and then the Mujahideen controlling large parts of the rural areas. And that's not very different from what you see today between the government-controlled and the Taliban-controlled areas. Soviet then finally withdrawing in '89, and 3 years later you have the Afghan communist regime collapsing. And a key reason to that collapse was the fact that the communist regime was very much dependent on Soviet funding. So with the collapse of the Soviet Union, also seizing of Soviet funding, the Afghan state communist regime collapsed. And this is a characteristic of the Afghan modern state since its inception in the 18th century. It's always been very much kind of dependent on support from outside and gotten used to free money, so to speak, from elsewhere. So not developed strong bonds or social contract, if you wish, with its own citizens, but much of the revenue coming from external sources rather than taxation, and not really having a kind of responsiveness or accountability for delivering to citizens. And one could argue that that is very much still a dilemma of the Afghan state today. The Soviet withdrawal left a power vacuum, which meant that the Mujahideen then took over in '92. But their takeover was soon followed by infighting among the Mujahideen groups, sometimes called warlordism. So you had a chaotic civil war situation. A lot of destruction of Kabul happened then, and widespread corruption and lawlessness. And some today then, analogous to that, say, do we see history repeating itself now? Will there be a vacuum created with the withdrawal of foreign troops? And in the absence then of a viable political process, are we again moving towards a full-scale civil war? There are some signs today of anti-Taliban Mujahideen groups again mobilizing. As a reaction to the lawlessness and the civil war among the Mujahideen groups, you then in the mid-90s had the Taliban movement, which kind of came out of the radical madrasas in Pakistan. Taliban means religious student. Predominantly based in the Pashtun ethnic groups, and sweeping in as a Puritan Islamic force, kind of cleaning up the mess of warlordism and putting focus on combating sinful city life, seeing Kabul as Sodom and Gomorrah, and establishing then, entering into Kabul in '96 and establishing a rather repressive and totalitarian regime, and starting to issue edicts banning, co-working among women and men, infringing on women's rights, and so on. Getting some backing by Pakistan, particularly ISI, the intelligence agency. And Pakistan, still today, of course, is a key player in the fate of Afghanistan's future. This was a period of very weak social and economical development. A lot of the development aid was on humanitarian basis. You then have 9/11, 2001, attacks in the US. Turns out that the Taliban have been hosting Al-Qaeda and bin Laden, giving them a safe haven. You have the international coalition, US war on terror, intervening and swiftly ousting the Taliban regime. And that's when we start the so-called new era in Afghanistan post-2001. So you have a democratic constitution that's created, concerted state building efforts, and gradually an increasing military presence internationally, a massive military presence towards 2010-11. At the peak, during what they call the surge, you had about 140,000 troops in country. Both the UN-mandated ISAF troops and also the US-led Operation Enduring Freedom, the counterterrorism. You also have had a massive international aid during these 2 decades, funding large national development programs, partly through the state, but also through NGOs and a growth of civil society. And these 2 massive investments, and here I must highlight that the military spending, at least in terms of what the US has put into the country, has been 20-1. So almost $1 trillion being spent on military consumption, military presence, and about 40-50 billion US dollars on international aid. And these 2 large investments, of course, then also contributing to quite a lot of growth in the early 2000s, but to some extent, of course, artificial growth, and especially with the withdrawal of the military, especially 2014-15, when you saw the exit of ISAF, you also see economy then slowing down a lot. But it's also, of course, contributed to corruption with weak domestic institutions to absorb and control flows. And also during this period, you've seen massive returnees, also then from the neighboring countries, because you had about 6 million or more fleeing into Pakistan and Iran primarily. And during this last 2 decades, you've seen a few million returning. But also during the last 2 decades, we've seen then the gradual return and growth of the Taliban. And their presence has become increasingly apparent across the country. And I mean, we work in half the country, mostly in rural areas, and their presence is very visible. And they've established shadow government, you could say, in basically each province. So if there's a state government governor, there's a Taliban shadow governor, and so it goes on the various levels further down in the administration. And Taliban established then traditional courts in the rural areas, deal with local conflict resolution, are often swift and firm and harsh. You also, during this period, see a growth of the illegal opium industry. And of course, here you sometimes see, not only sometimes, quite often you see interest intertwined between armed opposition groups, the opium industry, but also sometimes, of course, political elites. So there's a bit of a narco state aspect also in Afghanistan. Right now, then, if I move over to, well, I could also mention that you also have, of course, what we have highlighted, then, grave disrespect for international humanitarian law. We have particularly been worried about both, of course, what the Taliban, how they affect civilian population, but also how both Afghan army and international troops have the grave disrespect for international humanitarian law. You have aerial and drone bombardments, night raids, special force operations that have affected the civilian population very badly, and also our interventions, clinics and schools being affected, health staff being killed, patients being injured, and so So the international presence has increasingly been perceived as part of the problem, and also nurturing discontent, and also nurturing kind of motivation to join armed opposition groups. So quickly, right now, if we try to take a quick survey of the current, say, political situation, after several years of kind of stalemates on the battlefield, where perhaps the Taliban have gradually taken steps forward in controlling at least countryside, but never really managing to hold bigger cities. The US and the Taliban then finally entering into talks, and in February 2020 in Doha, then coming to a deal, not a peace agreement, but a deal where the US commits to withdraw within 14 months, and the Taliban then committing to cut ties with international terror groups and prevent Afghan soil from being used to threaten US and its allies. A deal that indeed was very insulting to the Afghan government, that was neither involved nor even mentioned in the deal, hardly consulted. And we saw immediately after the deal a lot of confusion about what actually were the commitments in terms of, for instance, prisoners exchange and stuff like that. And of course, the deal has emboldened the Taliban, their narrative of, their cause is to oust the occupying forces, to free Afghanistan from the Kafir invaders, and so on. And it was also very painful for the civilian population, of course, because it didn't contain a ceasefire that everybody was hoping for. What we did see was just a temporary reduction in violence afterwards, but that has then again increased. However, a good thing coming out of it is that intra-Afghan talks have started, commenced in fall 2020 in Doha. Mostly so far focusing on procedural issues, not so much agenda content. But Taliban then being clear that their top priority is to turn the state, the government, the society into much more of an Islamic, in their interpretation of Islam, country, and seeing ceasefire as an end result. So they want to maintain their options of threatening and using force, while the government side then entering into negotiations saying, we want to secure a ceasefire first, and then we can also start negotiating power issues, reform of political system, and so on. And so far, the Taliban have not been moving an inch. And we've had concerns, of course, on the weak input from civil society, the weak participation of women. There are only 4 women, I think, in the government delegation, none in the Taliban. But there are also some encouraging signs of civil society mobilizing and raising voice and defending what has been achieved. Now, we were all waiting to know what Biden's policy would be. And finally, in mid-April, we then, of course, heard the news that they're not withdrawing by May. That was initially the agreements, the Doha February 2020 agreements, but symbolically by September 11th, 2021. Now, the Taliban considered this a breach of the agreement from Doha. And simultaneously, then a bit perhaps desperately, Blinken has floated this attempt at fast-tracking talks and saying, let's put a political solution at the table. Let's look at power sharing, which then has caused different interpretations. Ghani seems to be rejecting moving into handing over power, but insisting it has to go through elections. Taliban insisting that there's still a breach of contract with the US, and we're wondering a bit what will be the next step. And there's been an attempt at pushing for a conference in Turkey, which has now been delayed, but where the UN, Turkey and Qatar would jointly lead a conference where you would possibly look at a possible political solution. So that's where we basically stand right now. And in the meantime, we're all fearing, of course, together with the Afghan civilian population, what is really at stake and what may happen if the Taliban, at the end of the day, as it seems, would get part or even fully take over power of the country. Are we back to the brutal regime of the 90s, or is there a different kind of Taliban today? And what will be sacrificed on the altar of peace?
Okay, thank you. That was quite an exhaustive recap, which is useful because there are many things there that we can, threads that we can pick up. One, of course, looming, as you said, is what's going to happen once the US and maybe other parties withdraw, so to speak, and what the real, if you will, what the real power dynamics are on the battlefield. But there's more. I mean, Afghanistan is more than a battlefield. So before we get to that bit, let's instead delve into Afghan society and where things are there. Fatima, I know you worked in NGOs and you worked on issues, not just on the Afghan one. So in a sense, we can say there is a kind of a general assessment here, which is here we have a country with a weak, if you will, failing or failed central state. Different parties pour a lot of money in. The results are not in any way in proportion to the amount of money being poured into it. And the question always is why? Why can't we get more quality, so to speak, for the money invested? But let's kind of concentrate on the Afghan case. But again, in order to not make it look as if it's a very unique situation, where it's only here that you have corruption and so on, let's also think that this is a generic problem that we have when people are trying to come from the outside and help a society to kind of get back on its feet. So where do things stand in Afghan society? I mean, what are the forces, civil society, the political parties? These are things that we find everywhere. So the question is, what do they look like here? And one more thing I want to kind of park, but I just want to flag here is generational differences. Do we see that here as much as we see elsewhere in the Middle East, where both when it comes to the political parties, but in society in general, that very different experiences because of very different age groups also means very different ideas of what the choices are. Fatima, pick wherever you want to start, and we'll run with you.
I might, hi, Ruzve, and thank you, Andreas, for your opening presentation, and thank you for organizing this event. I'm going to start with your last point in terms of what we can expect in terms of the divisions in Afghan society, and can we expect the kind of political upheavals that we've seen in sort of Afghanistan's west, in the Middle East, and North Africa? And my answer to that is absolutely yes. I think that there is a huge divide in Afghanistan between the sort of quite aged male elite that purport to represent Afghanistan and a population that is more than I believe 60% of it is under the age of 18. It is a very young society. And what we've seen in the aftermath of the intervention in Iraq, for example, is that today now we have well, since 2019, we've had a steady upsurge in popular youth resistance against the factions and political elite that emerged in the aftermath of the US war and then withdrawal. I suspect that we're going to see a similar kind of pattern in Afghanistan over the next 5 to 10 years, simply because I don't see the formal political institutions or formal political actors adjusting in any way to accommodate the actual needs of Afghan men and women and girls and boys. I think Afghan society in many ways remains highly factionalized along the lines that you saw in the Civil War. And this is not really, I think, coincidental. Most of the divisions or disagreements that sparked the Civil War sort of haven't gone away, and the core problem of sort of the northern groups versus the southern Taliban still sort of defines a great deal of this conflict, even though actors have shifted and new ones have appeared and so on. But fundamentally, the disagreement about who rules Afghanistan, who rules Kabul, who has power at the central level, who has power at the provincial level, these are all questions that sort of still kind of complicate and animate political life in Afghanistan, but they are, because of the war, continually being resolved through violence. As Andreas mentioned, in the last couple of years, there's been a steadily growing violent campaign of targeted assassinations against journalists, against civil society activists and human rights activists in the country. And I think that this is, Afghanistan was sort of building up a new intelligentsia, which had been destroyed during the communist era and then never rebuilt. And so that we can sort of see that kind of intelligentsia has been rebuilding. Some have returned from outside Afghanistan, but a great number are now also leaving again because of the threats to their life and the increased instability throughout the country. Because I don't have that much time to actually tackle all the questions that we've raised, I'm going to turn to your original question of that you presented to me about corruption in Afghanistan and the capacity of the state to function post-2021. The first thing I want to say is that it is actually impossible to divorce the issue of why Afghanistan is so corrupt from the conduct and direction of the war. It's not as though corruption didn't exist in Afghanistan before 2001. My grandfather was a minister in the 70s in Afghanistan when the country had a prime minister and a cabinet, and it was sort of making moves towards constitutional monarchy. And even then, sort of supplicants would turn up at the door of government officials with gifts and bribes. And so it's like it's not like petty corruption didn't exist. It did exist. But what we're talking about since 2001 is corruption on an industrial level, which was essentially accelerated because of the vast quantity of money and aid that was moving through the country. And that influx of money is not neutral. It's not simply that the money was wasted, which seems to be people's greatest concern about aid money. Was it wasted? It's worse than that. Because in Afghanistan, the money that kind of came in for aid and development was used to empower a certain political elite. So aid is not neutral. Aid creates political consequences. And Afghanistan has a war economy that has a certain elite who have captured the economy. And the reason this has happened is because, again, we can't separate corruption from the direction of the war. When the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001 and then went on to set up a transitional government and then an elected government, it chose to partner with some of the worst people in Afghan society, like without qualification. These are people who are murderers, war criminals, rapists, pillagers, essentially the people who had wrecked the country during the Civil War. They didn't have a good track record in Afghan society, but they did have a good military and sort of intelligence partnership with the US ever since the Soviet War. And so the US turned to kind of its usual partners in Afghanistan, but I don't think we should be particularly surprised by the character of the state, given who populates it. And we see again that not just corruption, but the Afghan economy at large turns on what international spending is happening there. And as Andreas pointed out, since 2001, there has been a precipitous drop in Afghan GDP because most of the GDP growth from 2001 onwards was driven by the international presence and military spending. There are sort of technical factors that affect why there's so much corruption and lack of oversight. And this has to do with how third parties or sort of outside governments spend money in Afghanistan, because most spending in Afghanistan is off budget. It's not in the control of the Afghan government. I believe 60% of spending in Afghanistan is still done off budget. And I don't want to pretend that any of the international actors had better oversight of their spending either, because the US being the sort of dominant actor, its own development agency, USAID, is under criminal investigation for the levels of fraud that were perpetrated in Afghanistan. So this is a multi-layered problem. And when I said earlier that corruption, sort of the corruption in aid have like distinctly political dimensions, you had incidents where the US military would destroy an entire village. It would level a village because the Taliban had booby-trapped it, for example. And they would clear out the village and they would tell the villagers, we are going to rebuild your homes and we're going to rebuild your land, etc. But once the village had been destroyed and new contracts had to be given to the contracting agencies or the construction agencies who would then rebuild that village, it would turn out that they would be tied to whoever was the most powerful person in that area. And this happened over and over and over again, and it was particularly acute during the Karzai era, but it continues today. And this is all a problem because Afghans have seen this money come into the country and they've seen where it's been spent and they know it's not on them. Insofar as not only has Afghanistan witnessed a very sharp economic decline since 2014, the aid and development agencies confirmed that it's backslid from a situation where it's a developing country to one where that is again in humanitarian crisis, which I don't think speaks well to the last 20 years of effort. And this corruption, or sort of this perception of corruption, is a major driver of the insurgency, and was a driver of the insurgency when it started to pick up steam again in 2006, 2007, and it remains a sort of general complaint of Afghans at large. What does all of this corruption mean for sort of the future function of the state? I think the preponderance of effort and spending in Afghanistan, as Andreas pointed out earlier, has been on security and military efforts. And despite some successes in health and education, I think the education numbers are inflated because we've seen a sort of consistent trend of schools closing across the country, especially in areas where the Taliban are present. And the government late last year was discussing kind of conducting public education at lower levels through masjids, through mosques, rather than the public education system, because that's how little access there is to schooling. And the sort of, when I think about Afghan society, kind of going back to the original point, 80% of Afghan women and girls are still illiterate. This seems to me perhaps the single greatest obstacle to Afghanistan's future development and progress. It is simply impossible for a society to function when almost half of the population, and the female half of the population, is illiterate. But again, the state's capacity to function, there's been huge security buildup in Afghanistan, but to very mixed effects. Some parts of the Afghan armed forces, the special forces in particular, function quite well, the police less so. The army keeps coming up with different arrangements to police different areas of the country and is overstretched. I think we may face this. Zalmay Khalilzad was testifying in Congress this week and assures that the US will not be suspending any aspect of its aid to the Afghan security forces. I am more skeptical, but even with consistent support, even if it's consistent financial support, I don't think the Afghan security forces have the ability to hold off a continued Taliban fight. And I believe that the Taliban fight will continue through in any sort of peace talks that are happening along the way. I don't think that either side at this moment is negotiating in good faith. But I think those are my 7 minutes, Ruzbe, but I'm happy to keep going or elaborating in any direction.
Well, we will have several rounds, so don't worry. But I want to kind of resist the Taliban vortex in this conversation for a little longer. And I want to pick on something that both of you mentioned. I mean, on the one hand, Afghanistan is a country with a relatively low level of urbanization. And yet at the same time, it's one of the countries in Asia with the highest rate of urbanization. So as in, still the majority of the population don't live in cities, but it's also one of the countries where most people are moving into the cities. And that kind of begs to me the question that we addressed a little bit when we discussed age, which is the social fabric. I mean, how are it not just being, torn apart because of war, but what kind of new social fabric is being built by the fact that people are no longer where they used to be, where they cannot use the land because maybe the village isn't left anymore, it's not there, or the land is not for them, they cannot use it. So agriculture, all of those traditional ways of making a living on the countryside don't exist to the same degree and under the same circumstances. So my question would be, so what does all of this mean when you have a population that is this extremely young, is moving away from the countryside into these cities, towns, and where the social and political system is probably not going to be able to absorb them because the social and the political system maybe not, it's either not existing to that extent, nor is it functional where it exists. Andreas, would you like to take on that challenge first?
Yeah, what you're portraying here is, of course, a huge potential, but also a huge challenge for the country, of course. I think, if I just give a few snapshots, I think it's quite fascinating to see the difference today in the Afghan countryside. If you go to district centers or provincial centers, difference, or even rural areas, difference between now and say 10, 15 years ago in connectivity, where youth today are, on social media, connected through mobile networks that reach out into rural areas and can easily, communicate with youth across the whole country, while 15 years ago they would basically just know what's going on in their own valley. but as you say, the high rate of urbanization, of course, puts a lot of pressure on the country, its economy, to be able to absorb the voices that are now raised for, accountability, for responsive government, but that's also a huge potential for the country. I think the big young population that, although you're correct, Fatima, of course, we still have huge challenges with millions not going to school, and particularly girls and women being illiterate. But still, among the generation that's growing now, you have a majority actually going to school. There are a few million still out of school, but you still have a whole generation that, roughly speaking, are starting to learn to read and write. And I think this is a kind of long-term transformation that is happening in Afghan society, where they will be able to also increasingly demand accountability. And you were talking, Fatima, about corruption, which is of course a huge challenge in the country. But I think we're seeing how youth are finding ways of channeling their voice and mobilizing and networking, and not necessarily going through a lot of formal civil society organizations always, but doing it through social media and so on. I could take an example of when I was in Kabul in March, you had this singing ban that was announced by the Ministry of Education, suddenly saying that girls were not allowed to sing in school and not participate in cultural events. And that ban came out on Wednesday or Thursday, and we entered into weekend. The formal NGOs and networks were like discussing with each other, should we react and so on. But what you had on social media was a very swift reaction from various parts of society, and particularly the young, and a broad range of actors, from the Afghan Independent Human Rights Commission to the Afghan National Institute of Music, the ones who won the Polar Prize in Sweden, to a lot of individual civil society actors and so on, reacting, and people also calling, of course, people at the ministry saying, what the heck is going on? And 2 days later, the ministry having to go out and say, been some kind of misunderstanding, we withdraw that decision, we'll look into it internally, blah, blah, blah. When I visit our programming, if I step into a midwifery school today, in the past, we struggled to find the qualified enough girls from rural areas who had passed grade 12, who could join the midwifery school and then go through 2.5 years of training and becoming a qualified midwife, because you didn't have enough rural girls that had gone through 12 years of schooling yet. Now there are queues to the midwifery schools of girls that have passed, teenagers that have passed grade 12 and are willing to become midwives as they move into adulthood. And there's this kind of, it's a long-term transformation that's happening in society, and I think for sure there's a great challenge in society with it, but it's also promising. And I think whether we talk about engaging in demanding peace and sustaining peace into the future, but also in combating corruption, I think there is a potential here with an increasingly educated and empowered and connected citizenship, particularly among young. There are some opportunities into the future. I also want to just touch on what Fatima said with regards to the lack of oversight for corruption and so on. I think also here we work a lot in the rural areas, and I think we're also seeing that by strengthening and mobilizing local communities, strengthening population in rural areas through education, through healthcare, through being part of local decision making, they can also start to demand more transparency, accountability. That, coupled with conditioned aid and pushing for continued reforms, I think can turn the tide better in terms of corruption. Try to keep it on a hopeful note. Yeah.
Okay. My question would be, and I'm going to be a bit unfair, I'm not going to give the question to you, I'm going to give it to Fatima, is the developments that Andreas are pointing to, because some things are going in the right direction, they might not go as quickly as anyone would wish and so on, but are they happening despite or thanks to the state? Now I'm asking this question because in a sense, you can have all kinds of wonderful things happening in society, but at some point they need the kind of institutional framing and buoyance that only a state in the modern world can give them. And so the question here then, does that state exist? Does it see these things? Is it capable of helping? Or is all of this happening kind of devoid of state presence?
To put it quite bluntly, I think the way you framed it is correct. I think these things are happening in spite of the state. I don't think they're happening because of the state. Let's just look at the question of how the Afghan government deals with the question of unemployment. I don't even know what the unemployment rate is now during COVID, but it's just become worse and worse because Afghanistan is very poor, primarily agricultural, and the work that's not being done by agriculture is usually being sort of exported through migrant labor, either to Pakistan or to Iran. These conditions have become worse because of COVID. So there's a great deal more poverty than there was a year ago, where Afghans have managed to kind of chisel away. Oh, let me take a step back. The Afghan government says that it has plans and strategies for increasing employment in the country. But we don't see any of them, right? Because the trend is going very much in the obvious, in the other direction. So where young Afghans find a way to kind of find a job, work for an international organization, try and get a scholarship to study abroad, they find ways to make that happen. But if you're asking me, how is this sort of new movement and new thinking and a sort of a new awareness of what's happening in the world, a complete fatigue with sort of entire generations who have only seen war, obviously there's a readiness and a willingness to move to something else, but because it's not organized, as you were saying, Ruzbe, I think that this is the real challenge, or sort of the real, the thing I'm most interested in seeing in Afghanistan, I guess I could say, is who are the next generation of Afghan political leaders? And I'm not talking about the children of the warlords who are hanging around in the 90s. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about a new generation of Afghans who are truly invested in making the state work for everyone. I don't see that group of people existing just quite yet, not as an organized whole. You see them as individuals, but it's hard to see how that's going to come together. And part of this has to do with the Afghan political system, where political parties aren't as powerful as they are in parliamentary systems, for example. And political parties are really almost more a vehicle of ethnic or nationalist preferences, rather than organized political movements that advocate for certain policy agendas.
Good. So, I mean, that means then that, if you will, these young potential stars are there, but they have not coalesced into a social movement or a political movement that could allow them to institutionally kind of be a counterweight to the old guard, so to speak.
I think that's correct, and I think that, you know, sort of the war has impeded what would otherwise have been, I think, a period of, so I mean, imagine with me, if you will, a world where the Taliban weren't removed from power in 2001. I think by 2021 they would have been out of power. I think they would have been sort of pushed out of power in that intervening time. This war has only actually made them stronger. It's made them stronger militarily. I think it's hardened their positions, and on the other side, I think younger Afghans, because of the overwhelming patriarchal conservatism, religious conservatism that's sort of been pushed down from above for so long, I'm starting to see the pushback against that as well. Or in the sense, I think the argument is that these were leaders who argued for religion, or sort of the importance of religion in public life and all the rest of it. And none of it has kind of come to bear any kind of fruits for us as a society.
Fair point. Andreas, do you want to add something?
I mean, I have concerns. I hear a lot of cynicism among youth about the democratic experience of the last 2 decades, and not necessarily seeing political participation as a way of trying to, reform Afghanistan, rather being quite cynical. And I mean, I think you also touched on that, Fatima, that the political party system is weak, very much individual ethnic leaders, and when you look at, for instance, I was in Kabul when you had the run-up to the parliamentary elections, and the way candidates were portraying their messages, you actually go to the printing press, and the printing press gives you an option of several different political messages that you can choose between. So the printing press has become like the spin doctors, and you don't really represent a party, but you're just a leader of a group from a specific geographical area or so. So the youth express a lot of cynicism, but I think I still see that there is a broad consensus on the need and the importance of a state, and the stability that the state could bring, and people want to have a functioning state, a responsive state, not the dysfunctional and corrupt one that you have right now. And perhaps that's also where the battle is to some extent between what the Taliban are offering and what the government is offering. But I think what you have in Afghanistan right now is actually a process where the role, the establishment, the structure, and the presence of the state is still being negotiated. Looking at the history where the state has not really fully been, properly consolidated. And you have a growth of basic services now that have been channeled through large national priority programs within health, education, rural development, and so on, where the state has opted for a model where they contract out to actors like us. So state services are being rolled out, and people are getting used to actually accessing some state services. And I think Ashraf Ghani, the president, has also been the brainchild for some of them, and also talking about offering people in rural areas kind of a basic package of essential services that should be available to everybody. And it's kind of, you're in the process of trying to establish a social contract. And this is where the Taliban also then try to counteract that, saying, we have something else we're offering you. We're offering you swift conflict resolution. We're offering you stability to the price of perhaps repression or getting into nitty-gritty of what you wear and what you look like. But I think looking at the basic services that have evolved, I think a lot of people, and including the Taliban, have come to accept and also appreciate the developments you see with regards to state services, at least in the social sectors. So today it's a no-brainer that there should be a public education among the broad population, and even in rural areas, if you consult with village elders, education comes very high on their agenda of what they want to offer themselves and their communities, even girls. Health services are taken for granted that should be what the state is contributing to, even though it contracts out through NGOs. And even then the big Citizens Charter program, as it's called, where the state through international funding and in partnership with NGOs is channeling out development projects to communities to cater for very basic local needs of building a culvert, putting tar on a road, or improving solar paneled electricity in the villages and so on. Even the Taliban actually understand that the local communities want and appreciate these services or these interventions, and sometimes try to get into a role of putting demands, acting within the realm of, say, local governance, saying, okay, we're the gatekeepers here. We know that the local population want to have these services, but we have certain demands. And they, of course, as we all know, also try to tax some of this and feed themselves, so to speak, their own movement to taxing state services and also private sector. But I think the development of the state is kind of still a challenge in Afghanistan. You talked about the void of a state. And it's perhaps also what is the battle between the parties now that are trying to negotiate. What would the future state look like? But I think that the youth here, we still don't see really strong political movements. We see grassroots movements. We see social media activism. We see keenness to having a state. But I think you're pointing at something very crucial there. That the youth are not really mobilizing politically.
Okay, thank you. I mean, in a sense, what you're saying, especially what you mentioned, Fatima, is that we're dealing with a system which is still kind of stuck into political patronage, which is in no way unique for Afghanistan. And you could even describe some of the Western system as being much more about political patronage than parties. You look at the US system where the party system isn't that very strong, actually. It's more vehicles for elections. But let's now tackle the vortex of the Taliban. one of the reasons why the Taliban were initially, at least, somewhat popular in the 1990s, following on the civil war, when the Mujahideen kind of went at each other instead, was that the corruption and the chaos and the war that the Mujahideen waged after having thrown out Najibullah and all the kind of the Soviet-style elements of the government, was that they offered stability and uniformity. Instead of having to deal with 10 devils, you dealt with one devil. That was, at least, if you will, the sales pitch, if you want to be a bit sanguine about it. And this is not unique to Afghanistan. I mean, we see that with a much more extreme example, which would be the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, where they were seen as, you know, we would have to deal with one group. They were harsh, but at least you kind of knew where they were. The Taliban will not be able to sell themselves with that argument again, obviously, because now people have experience of when they governed, which didn't go particularly well. And so they are not an unknown card. But at the same time, the Taliban today aren't necessarily the Taliban of the 1990s or the 2000s. Because if we have generational shifts within Afghan society, and so this is my question, I'm not arguing this is necessarily the case, but do we see similar shifts or tensions within the Taliban as a movement in terms of the old guard who were there when they first got their hands on power, and the ones who have perhaps primarily had their formative experience fighting the Americans after having been ousted from power? So that's one question. The other question, the looming question, which we don't have to tackle right now, let's begin with the first one. But the second question, I just want to kind of add it to the soup, is what, from a very American-centric perspective, is when the US leaves, is Afghanistan going to turn into Cambodia, or is it going to turn into Vietnam? As in, are the Taliban going to take revenge, more Cambodia, Khmer Rouge style, or are they going to basically just topple the government and control the whole place and kind of go out into the cold as far as America is concerned? It will be repressive, but it will be some kind of unified government for the country. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily the two most realistic or apt analogies. I'm just saying that it shows you the spectrum of scenarios that people are fearing or imagining could happen. And we can get to that in a little while. But first, who are the Taliban today compared to 10 or 20 years ago? Are they the same people, or can we see nuances within that group as well? Fatima, would you like to start?
Yeah, I'd like to start. Thank you. I think that just as we saw how the Taliban conducted themselves in the 90s, we see how the Taliban conduct themselves today, because they do control, in effect, half of the country. And so we see how they govern, and it is actually not radically different from how they governed in the 1990s. And there have been attempts to shift the kind of demographics and constituencies of the Taliban over time. This was the centerpiece of counterinsurgency. If you remember the heyday of counterinsurgency campaigns in Afghanistan circa 2009, 2010, the goal there was to actually, the American military strategy was to try and cripple the Taliban's chain of command by killing or capturing its mid-level commanders. But the mid-level commanders were the pragmatists of the movement. So what you had instead was a younger, more radicalized, more angry, more aggressive cadre of Taliban fighters who were then elevated to the middle ranks. I'm not one of those people who thinks that there are like gentle and sweet Taliban. I don't know that we need to there is an appetite for whitewashing who the Taliban are even now that I'm quite wary of. I think that we should be very, very clear-eyed about who the Taliban are. They have consistently shown us who they are. They haven't sort of moderated their public opinions or behavior for anyone, not for Afghans, not for foreigners, for no one. So I don't have a great deal of hope that, it doesn't have to be about hope. You just have to observe. If you read about what life is like in Afghanistan, where the Taliban has control, and there's extensive reporting about it, it doesn't paint a pretty picture. And I think that we can look forward to a lot of the same.
Thank you. So, and I mean, yes, I mean, it's interesting that we tend to think that younger people necessarily are more open-minded, but that's not always the case. So in this case, you seem to argue that it's the other way around. Andreas, what's your take?
I would agree to quite a lot to what Fatima said, but I think we could also remind ourselves that the Taliban are not necessarily monolithical, and you do definitely get different factions. You do get the hardliners, the moderate ones, and perhaps the ones who spend more time in Doha and then also belong to the kind of more political wing are perhaps more moderate. And you then get, the Haqqani network, which are very kind of terror-oriented, and hardliners, and you get different families that lead the Taliban movement. And I think even in Afghanistan, you see differences between different regional areas, and that's a bit like how the Taliban were even when they ruled. You had central government edicts, but once you came out into rural areas, you had different local Taliban leaders, who some were very hardlining in terms of infringing women's rights and girls' access to education and so on, while other local Taliban leaders were actually more open-minded to it, and you could kind of negotiate and find ways to pragmatically somehow provide education. We did that in some Taliban areas, managed to provide education to girls, but in settings where you had to live up to certain segregational demands and so on. But I think it's difficult to say that the Taliban would try to reinstate the oppressive regime of the 90s. I wouldn't really want to draw that gloomy picture. I think we're heading into a situation where the Taliban, in one way or the other, will have share power, or, if I may say, worst case, then have full power. But in one way or the other, they'll influence the future in politics. And I think the process in itself could possibly moderate the Taliban. They do, I think, at least parts of their leadership do understand what's at stake. I'm not sure that the Taliban want to end up in a, isolated, as they were then, totally isolated, say, an Islamic North Korea or whatever, and lose out also on the big international support that Afghanistan is benefiting from today. And also, I think they are keen on being able to have international recognition into the future. And I think, coming back to what we talked a bit about before with civil society and the youth and so on, I think at least some parts of the Taliban understand that there is another Afghanistan today. It's not really that kind of totally torn apart through years of civil war and so on moon landscape as when they took over Kabul in the 90s. So they would face another kind of resistance today. And I think, I took this singing ban. You could see that as a test balloon of whether, if a government with Taliban influence would start to impose things, there would certainly be reactions, and it would be a very ungovernable country. Now, furthermore, you also have the former Mujahideen groups, the anti-Taliban Mujahideen groups, I could say, who are already now kind of indicating that they would mobilize. Putting all these things together, I think at least the more moderate minds within the Taliban leadership understand that they have to have perhaps other dreams than reinstating the Taliban regime of the 90s. However, having said that, let's assume then that you actually get a moderate Taliban into a proper political process, and it leads to some kind of political solution, and at the end of the day, a peaceful path forward. You might very well end up with a situation where you get breakaways, considering themselves being the real Taliban, then the hardliners, perhaps joining hands with IS or creating new groups. So it might not really solve the puzzle fully. I hope, Fatima, this didn't sound like a whitewashing of the Taliban, but perhaps making the picture even more complicated. Yeah.
It's not that I think that there's a whitewashing. I think that there is a kind of optimism about how the Taliban will moderate their position when there's no evidence of that. And I think that they have become, especially given now that they believe that they won this war, I don't think that they are looking at this from the position of people who need to compromise, the other people who need to compromise. And so I think that there will be a sort of protracted period of violence, because I think that the Taliban are not treating the political negotiations as a way to join an existing government. They see any kind of political negotiation about setting the terms of a new government, which they, as the victors of the war, should be allowed to set. And I don't think there's much, if again, the Turkey conference was postponed, the Taliban now are saying that they're going to attend, but they won't send a high level delegation, and they absolutely will not talk about any serious or kind of any questions about future political arrangements. They don't want to have the conversation. I genuinely believe they think that they've won, they'll take Kabul, and everyone else will have to fall in line. I don't think that they're going to look for an in-between position. The traditional model of sort of representation in Afghan politics has been this weird notion of percentages. Like, you know, the Tajiks control 30% of the government and the Pashtuns control 60%. And sort of there's some perception that the Taliban might come and play this percentages game. I don't think they will. I don't think that even if it were a situation where they said, okay, the executive and the security forces have to be under the Taliban. Like at a minimum, I would expect that the security forces and the executive would have to be under Taliban control. I can't see any situation where they would like accede or join the current political arrangements without that. But the Afghan government will never concede it, I don't think. And so I think that they are in fact prepared to keep fighting.
So, I mean, in a sense, what you're saying is that the Taliban are going to rewrite the framework of the state rather than join the existing setup.
Yeah.
But if they're going to rewrite it, are they going to do it in any kind of negotiation? I mean, it's one thing to think that you won the war, and in effect, maybe they have, but it's another thing to then think that everyone else will just simply fall in line and do what you want them to do, because you still have to govern the place. So in a sense, the question perhaps isn't just whether they are willing to negotiate with the other actors controlling the state, but to what extent are they cognizant of the fact that they have to also find some kind of modus vivendi with society? Or do they think that they're just going to reshape the whole thing, or try to, again, like they did in the 1990s? Fatima Ayub.
No, I don't think that the Taliban are trying to reach a modus vivendi with society. See, there is, again, this is my sort of, like, no, I'm not enamored of the Taliban, and I'm not enamored of the Afghan government. But I would, you know, all of those of us who are studying Afghanistan read the Taliban's political statements, we read their so-called political strategies, we read the edicts and the directives from the leadership. There's nothing in it to suggest a kind of, what shall we say, a need to accommodate Afghan society, or a need to kind of, it's very much sort of an attitude of like, we're on the side of right, where this was the jihad, we defeated the Americans, and a lot of Afghans buy this narrative as well, is the thing. Do I think that the Taliban will look for an accommodation with Afghan society? They should. Do I think they will? I'm not sure.
Okay, but I mean, and again, I'm not trying to paint the picture rosier than it is, and it isn't particularly rosy, but what you're saying at the same time is that they have some kind of support in society. Would you be willing to try and gauge how big that is?
It's hard. No, I can't. And I'll tell you why. Because the Taliban to this day govern by fiat. They govern sort of through control. They don't govern by sort of accommodation. And that for me is sort of it's self-evident in a way, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I understand. I mean, this is not a democratic movement. It's a very violent kind of guerrilla / state organization. So fear is the key element. But nonetheless, somewhere usually what you try and do is you try and win over some people, at least, because it becomes a bit difficult to sustain your control if it just comes from the fear of your Kalashnikov. So the question is whether they are trying to do that, and then the subsequent question would be if they're successful and with who they are successful. But we can park that question for a moment. Andreas, What's your take on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree to what you said, Fatima, that there will be protracted violence. I don't see that this would end within soon. I think the Taliban so far have proved to be very clear on what they're good at, saying no and continuing to coerce, and have not shown great appetite to move their positions or start to talk about, you know, what a future Afghanistan actually will look like and so on. So, well, apart from insisting everything has to be according to a very rigid Islamic, you know, interpretation, but yeah, I mean, sorry, Rusbe, can you please give me your question again?
No, I'm just trying to explore how
perceptions.
what
Sorry.
well, I mean,
you were asking
the
support.
strength
I
of
would like to comment that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you know, it's interesting. Asia Foundation do massive kind of opinion polls, and they have come recently with a polling of some 12,000 people they interviewed and so on. And one interesting thing is that 90% find it important that we continue defending women's rights in Afghanistan. And I think that, again, talking about what the Taliban would intend into the future and what kind of state they would have, I think at least the moderate factions understand that Afghanistan is different today. And the Taliban themselves have to some extent expressed and shown. I mean, just the fact that they're themselves using social media and so on. While in the 90s they banned TVs and radios and singing and so on. Yeah, I would guess if the Taliban at the end of the day actually become a political party, I don't think you would have more than say 5-10% voting for them. I don't think there's much of popular support at all for the Taliban. I think in some areas people just want to get their lives, daily lives going, and they don't really always bother as long as one of the parties creates stability. Because what you have in Afghanistan today is I mean, in the areas that are contested, and that's the large part of Afghanistan. That's where it's troublesome, but also for us to run, you know, social services and so on. But in areas where the Taliban have full control or the government have full control, that's where it's basically stable and less troublesome for people to get their daily lives going. Of course, you don't see promotion of rights that much in Taliban-controlled areas. But no, I don't think I wouldn't say that they have much popular support at all. And I think they know that. Another aspect I would like to mention here is, of course, also what the Taliban will want into the future is also, of course, dependent on what kind of links they have to external parties and to support from neighboring countries. And I think what you've seen in the kind of forging of a consensus where there's a bit of a win-win in the puzzle among the different key actors in terms of economic development, you know, Afghanistan being sometimes it's called the roundabout of Central Asia, you know, with transit of gas pipelines, of you know, the Chinese seeing huge potential in minerals, rare earth minerals, you know, natural gas, copper, iron. So economical and stability, you know, peace aspects. Knowing that Russia then, of course, doesn't want to have Islamic, you know, impulse into or support into Islamic groups in or extremists into Central Asia, China, of course, economical interest, but also then the fear that, you know, say extremist groups in the Uyghur areas. But I think particularly with Pakistan, where Pakistan stands in what it commits itself to, and at least what Pakistan verbally expresses, and in, you know, after conferences on, is that it commits in the same way as the other actors to a political solution. And I think what you're having right now, before a possible Turkey conference, is actually the Taliban leadership going to Pakistan, saying that they're going to consult with their elders in their own shuras, you know, in Quetta and Peshawar and so on. But as Saleh, the vice president of Afghanistan, said the other day, when they go to Pakistan to meet elders, they're actually consulting with Pakistan ISI, intelligence services. So let's say they do both, but nevertheless, I think that's also a very crucial factor to where we end up with what Taliban actually want in the continued negotiations, the support they can mobilize externally. But I think we should not underestimate the power of, you know, what's at stake. That the Taliban would likely want, if they enter into power, a situation where they can actually continue to sustain themselves and sustain their power. And I don't think it would be sufficient for them to just extort people or chip out of opium economy. And I think also in terms of governing capacity as such, they don't have much experience. I mean, what's happened in Afghanistan, the complexity of the state that has evolved the last 20 years. I talked to a colleague of mine in Afghanistan. He said they'll have to, if they enter into power, and they need people to get the administration running, they'll have to employ those technocrats that Ghani has been employing.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, it's capacity and ambition, two different things. But Fatima, what would be your timeline? I mean, let's say the Americans leave on September 11th, as they have said that they're going to. The coming year after that, what is that going to look like for Afghanistan?
I think it's going to look more violent. I think the current sort of military landscape, as I understand it, is that why the Taliban have not taken many major cities across the country and some of the big provinces. They are sort of positioned to. And I do think that they will continue to sort of launch those assaults if, in fact, they don't kind of get their way politically, which they won't. So there will be a fight. It's really a question of how, at this point, it really is a question of who's stronger, the Afghan security forces or the Taliban. This is very much a situation where they're going to be left to fight it out themselves. Now, I don't think that the Afghan security forces can hold, even with continued financial support. I also don't know how many of because the sort of standing up the Afghan security forces, the army, the police has been like an enormous labor and not a particularly successful one in terms of capacity or the ability to actually like fight a war or police a population. So I think that the Taliban have a very good chance of taking Kabul in a year's time. I wouldn't be in the least surprised.
Okay. Andreas, what is your assessment?
I think whatever assessment you do, you're always wrong with the future of Afghanistan. But if I still have a go at it, I agree that that there's not going to be a quick fix. It's going to be messy for quite some time into the foreseeable future. I think in terms of battlefield, I'm not sure that I think you will have a continued stalemate if there's a continued trying to fight it out on the battlefield. Perhaps Taliban being able to enter into provincial cities and perhaps holding too.
Sorry, Andreas, this is going to be my only interruption, I promise. I do not consider the situation in Afghanistan a stalemate. In a situation where since 2014, the decline of international forces, the Taliban have continued to capture territory. This is not a stalemate. Yeah. This is very much the Taliban still on the ascendant.
True, a gradual growth, but still not necessarily actually being able to control any of the provincial centers yet. That could be a development into the future. I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I think that you would also then start to see, apart from the Afghan security forces, you'd probably also see the mobilization of anti-Taliban militias in a way that we perhaps haven't seen so far. So you'd probably have more of a civil war, I would say, rather than just a swift Taliban takeover. But I think we're going to likely end up in some kind of, at the end of the day, some kind of power that is also given to the Taliban, whether it's shared power or they actually take a full control of the country. But what we have right now are very crucial processes where you are having that internal political process that hasn't really, become really effective, but is continuously being, being tweaked, and then you have the external actors trying to forge a consensus of how to support a stable Afghanistan towards peace and development into the future. And I would say that from the international community level, I mean, we have to continue with a long-term support, because we were talking before about this societal transformation, and I think that there have to be peace dividends, continued support to the civilians, civil society growing, protecting what has been gained, and keeping up the pressure on these parties, keeping up the pressure, support to the internal political process, but also pressure, and also pressure on the regional actors. And here I'm concerned because with the US withdrawing, the question is, will they sustain their interest in supporting this into the future? And who actually steps up and replaces them? We have Russia taking initiatives, China. Now with the UN, with the conference in Turkey, it's supposed to be co-hosted with the UN and Turkey and Qatar. And the question is UN willing to step up into the future? Because the ongoing negotiations so far, the challenge I think is that it's actually just the two parties trying to get their heads around how to negotiate, but it's not a facilitated, or there's no broker so far in the peace process. So yeah.
Let me just rewind there for a moment, because we're talking about a situation where negotiations have yet to start because they haven't even figured out how and who and what they're actually negotiating about, because they have very different ideas of who is already winning, so to speak, and therefore what need do they have to negotiate. But the difference now, I would imagine, compared to earlier phases of the last 40 years that we've kind of been moving back and forward on, is that when there has been civil war, there has been outside powers who've been interested in financing and sponsoring one or the other side of the two and many more sides that existed. But is that situation existent today? Or are we going to see regional powers and global powers falling back into their old styles and starting to bet money on different horses in this race? Or can we hope at least that most of them will refrain and therefore at least remove some of the oxygen for the fire? Fatima.
Unfortunately, I don't think anyone has learned anything in Afghanistan, and that is why we're in the situation that we're in. And yes, I think it's very troubling to me, at least, when you have actors like China and Russia, of all people, trying to put their fingers in Afghanistan again. I don't think anyone has learned any lessons. I think, as Andreas pointed out, both China and Russia have serious security concerns about Afghanistan. I think they'll be keeping a close watch, and they are physically closer than the US. They actually have more at stake. But the fundamental kind of animosity between Pakistan and India hasn't shifted, which is what has informed Pakistan's calculus in Afghanistan to begin with. So I don't see, and again, the other winner of the Afghan war, apart from the Taliban, are Pakistan's intelligence services. I mean, we were not really having an honest conversation about sort of the politics of this conflict, because they are incredibly convoluted. But almost everyone who has come through Afghanistan in the last 40 years has been a bad faith actor, and no one more so than Pakistan. And so, no, I think Pakistan have actually learned a perverse lesson, which is that we can keep doing this. We can actually successfully back an insurgency until they take control of a government. So yes, I suspect that everyone is sort of at this point kind of seeing how things are going to go. We're in a little bit of a holding pattern, not exactly because the Taliban and the Afghan forces are continuing to fight quite heavily. But I think politically, everyone is just going to hedge their bets for about 6 months and see where we go. But I don't think that anyone has learned a lesson on trying to kind of back a winning horse.
But okay, the Pakistani angle I can understand, but would you then say that the US, for instance, which earlier on either helped or turned a blind eye to Pakistan's involvement, are they going to be as tolerant? Not that they necessarily can dictate things to Pakistan, but will they kind of be as casual about it? That's one. The other one is, of course, Iran, because the difference between now and 20 years ago is that back then, Iran, obviously not a fan of the Taliban, but had nothing really invested in Afghanistan, and actually refrained from getting themselves bogged down in Afghanistan. Since then, they have actually moved their positions forward a lot, both in kind of antagonism with the US, but also because they have now economic interests and political interests in Herat and other places. So today, they cannot just simply kind of leave Afghanistan to its own devices, because they are much more enmeshed in Afghanistan. So you have that angle as well. Andreas, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think the enmeshment that you're talking about, I mean, I think several actors, most of the actors in the region feel that there is much more of enmeshment now and a lot of potential. I mean, you have the Central Asian countries that are keen to see their natural gas exploration to pass through Afghanistan to Pakistan and India. As you say, Iran, China with their economical ambitions, Belt and Road and so on. So I still think that conditions are better now than if you move back in time for finding some kind of regional consensus. But of course, that depends, again, as we've already stated, depends on dynamics in the region that, say, Pakistan has with India, the Iran-US dynamics, well, I mean, it's not an easy puzzle to lay. That Russia, of course, tried also then almost as a parallel process to the Doha process, you know, with their extended troika trying to pull actors together. But I think we're not really seeing a situation where any of these actors really would benefit, I think, from a full takeover of the Taliban that then leads to isolated Afghanistan, not funded. And I would also challenge the notion that Pakistan would like to have it in that way, because you do also have problems in Pakistan with their Taliban and so on. And I think that, India is also, of course, a player right now, and Pakistan is always fearful if Afghanistan ends up having close relations to India. So that's also, of course, part of the puzzle. If there is a negotiated settlement, how can you make Pakistan confident that what the negotiation ends up with in Afghanistan doesn't threaten them, in the sense that it becomes a very pro-India government? Yeah.
Fatima.
I think actually American reliance on Pakistan is only going to grow. The US has approached a couple of Central Asian governments to host some of their kind of regional military operations now that they have to leave Afghanistan. Those Central Asian governments have politely declined. So now the US is actually turning to Pakistan. And so this is going to be like deeply contentious in Pakistan, because I think the notion of like a permanent American military presence in a country that is ironically as anti-American as Pakistan is going to generate a whole host of new problems. But that's where, I mean, the US, I think, wants to kind of continue to keep Pakistan on side. In part, Pakistan matters more to the US than Afghanistan, despite the fact that the US fought a 20-year war there, simply because Pakistan continues to retain nuclear weapons. So they have bigger concerns about Pakistan than they even do about Afghanistan. But I think you're right. Like, I would have liked to imagine a scenario where regional actors played a constructive role in kind of helping Afghanistan bridge its way to sort of a better, peaceful, more prosperous society. But I'm sorry, let's look at the characters involved. Let's look at the Pakistani government. Let's look at the Russian government. Let's look at the Chinese government. I'm sorry, like, I don't see any of these actors responding in a kind of professional, mature diplomatic fashion. Where have we seen evidence of this? Please give me one example of where they have sort of behaved well anywhere in the world in the last decade, to where anyone would look at their efforts and be like, you know what, this could work.
Well, I'm going to have to try and be a bit optimistic. I mean, I wouldn't say necessarily that any single of these states has that ability. But now and then you see a confluence where they come together and, in a sense, balance each other out in a positive way, rather than just eliminating each other's influence. I'm not saying it's going to happen in this case, because we have a lot of movable parts, and I share your skepticism about Pakistan, because I think Pakistan's involvement in Afghanistan, in the way it also eaten into the Pakistani state and its various very murky parts, it makes these almost like Siamese twins in this respect. So it's not that easy to just kind of compartmentalize that. But nonetheless, I would like to hope that because of their own self-interests, they are all interested in something that at least looks like stability, and remains less of an upsetting variable in the regional equation. Whether that means that they can come into an agreement that is also positive for Afghan society and is sustainable, that is a big question mark, because that is not going to be their priority. That I fully agree. I mean, that's not their issue. Their issue is whether this can be a boon or whether it's going to be a headache for them. And Afghan society is secondary in this regard. Unless someone else has something that they would like to leave as parting words, I would like to thank both of you for this conversation. It hasn't necessarily been very uplifting, but I think it has been very informative and useful, because we have at least been able to pull a couple of threads and see some nuances, and perhaps also most importantly highlight Afghan society, and not just get stuck on the geopolitics and what the Afghan state is up to. So thank you very much, both of you, for participating in this. And I hope to see you again in 3 dimensions at some point to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jose.